All right, let's jump right into one of my favorite openings, the London system. So the London system is for the white pieces and it begins with the move d4. And the nice thing about the London system is that you can play it against pretty much anything that your opponent plays. You will put your pieces on the exact same squares. So let's take a look at what this setup exactly looks like. So I would say the defining move of the London is putting the bishop on f4. It's very strong here, looking at the center and just cutting down the middle of the board. It's really nicely placed on this square. And then we will continue with developing our pawns and creating this pawn chain. This is another defining feature of the London, is this pawn pyramid that is really difficult for black to crack. There are some cases where, for example, you want to put your knight here instead, or you actually want to play e4 if black isn't striking at the center right away, but we'll talk about those in just a bit. Continuing on, we want to just develop our pieces to normal squares, putting the knight on f3. And we don't have to worry about any striking in the center. If they take, we'll just recapture with the pawn. It's not a big deal at all. And c5 is something that your opponent will do if they know what they're doing. Usually, as black in d4 openings, you want to strike at the center as soon as possible. Placing a knight here before pushing your pawn, it makes your position a lot more cramped. So if you're struggling playing against the London on the black side, this is a move that you should be making because it is one of the more testing moves in the London or in any d4 opening. And as white, we don't want to capture this pawn because it gives away our control of the center, right? Black can just easily recapture. And even if they can't, if they haven't pushed this pawn yet, they're going to win this pawn back. It's not something we're going to be able to hang on to. And then we've just given up control of the center, which is basically the entire point of the London, is keeping a very solid, strong center. So anyways, continuing with our development, we want the knight on d2, because in the event this knight moves, we want to be able to refill that square with another knight. If our opponent continues to develop, we will complete our pawn chain like this. And then our next idea is to bring the bishop out to d3. This is a great square for this bishop. It's looking off in both directions, and it just has really nice central control. And then castles and castles. So this is a basic, perfect London position setup. This is where you want your pieces most of the time. Now, we will talk about cases where this is not necessarily how you want to set up, but a lot of times this is just a great place to start learning the general ideas of the London. To talk about early middle game stuff, we want to keep control of the e5 square as long as possible. We don't ever want to let this pawn push forward because it will just be a complete disaster. We have way too many pieces in the center that have the potential to get forked. And so a great way to do that, to keep control of the e5 square, is to plop a knight on that square and then refill with this knight. So going back a little bit, there are some moves that you should be aware of that you need to know how to respond to right off the bat. So for example, if black brings this bishop out, we need to do something about this bishop. There are lines where you can leave it here and recapture, and then you have a really strong knight in the center, and if this knight ever gets captured, you just recapture with the pawn, and you got a great center. You can play that way. The more common way to play this is to just rock the bishop back, and if black ever takes, we no longer want to castle this way, but we have this great open file. We can bring our bishop out, we can bring our queen out, and just launch a very belligerent attack, especially if our opponent castles this way, against the h-pawn, and we have a very nice open file because our opponent allowed us to trade off this piece. So this is not so scary. Don't worry too much about the doubled pawns. Another way you can do this, again, just right away, is putting this knight in the center. And you will want to very quickly be able to refill with this knight. And in some cases, you even want to rock this bishop back and refill with a pawn, open up the f-file. There's a lot of ways to play this. It's really hard to go wrong here, as long as you keep good control over this central square. Another move to look out for is if they play a little bit more symmetrical, so bringing these bishops out right next to each other. One way I like to play this is we can, of course, develop the knight, but we can then strike in the center with the move c4. And the idea of this move is, after a move like this, we want to bring the queen out. And the most common way to respond to this, because of course this pawn is under attack and the bishop has gone away from protecting this pawn, is to just bring the queen out like this. And there's a similar line that goes the opposite way, so black is actually doing this to the white position. But the idea is we want to push and entice black to make this trade, and then we have a very simple plan of just pushing this pawn up. Usually want to move this knight either here or here, just to give it a little bit more space on this side of the board. This knight can jump up here and have a really strong foothold in our opponent's position, and it's really hard for black to defend these pawns over here. We will have some very easy passed pawns to make. And again, I just like to make things easy for myself. So if I can make a plan that I know the next several moves of into the middle game even, that's a great idea for me. So even though these double pawns look kind of weird, it just makes it a lot easier to know what you want to do next. And then one more thing to look out for is if your opponent is playing the King's Indian. So something like this, we bring our bishop out, and if they go for this, we can actually play the knight to c3. There's ideas that are kind of similar to the fried liver where you can fork over here if your opponent's not careful to defend this square, but more often what we want to do is push in the center. So for example, after this, we want to just play 2 pawns in the center, very principled here. They will need to prevent this pawn from going forward like this. If they don't play this move and instead they just castle, you can immediately push in the center and this knight is running out of squares real quick. But if they play this in the way that they're supposed to, we're just going to slide our queen up, and after, for example, castles, we can castle. Usually they play a move like this, or they'll play the knight out. It doesn't really matter, but the whole idea is we want to bring our bishop up here and trade off this really strong bishop, right? So for example, if the knight comes out, we then want to push our h-pawn. It looks a little bit weird because we're just not developing these pieces, but this can actually be very difficult for black to defend. So if we push the h-pawn, say something like this. Usually the idea of this is that they want to kick the knight away and win this pawn, so we can even just defend it like this. Bringing the queen out, that's not a concern, of course. We can move the king over, so in the event the knight has to move, then we're not worried about getting checkmated on this side of the board. This is the most aggressive way for black to play, I would say. But say they go something like this, then we can take, they will take, we push this pawn. If they capture on the side of the board, we can then push the g-pawn forward, kick the knight back, and then we're getting checks. And it's getting scary, I'll tell you that much, for black. So I hope that gave you a great head start for the London system. Go play some games, go try it out, and then if you feel like you're liking the positions that you're getting, then it's time to dig a little bit deeper, find some other videos or courses, and add the London to your repertoire. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you soon.